Stop her immediately, because that woman is taking something from the warehouse." The sharp shout of Richard Barnes cut through the dusty air of the loading dock at Southern Horizon Storage in Detroit like a cracking whip. Mary Rollins froze a mere 3 steps away from the heavy exit gate, holding a large cardboard box tightly against her chest, her knuckles turning completely white from the intense strain. She did not turn around right away, but instead closed her eyes for a brief moment, took a very deep breath, and only then rotated her face toward the massive supervisor approaching her like a wounded bull, sweating profusely and pointing his thick thumb directly at her. The other workers, who were busy assembling evening orders in the vast aisles, began to step out one by one, deeply attracted by the sudden commotion, some still holding packing tape, while others left their barcode scanners resting on the metal shelves. The exhausting routine of the late afternoon shift had been entirely broken, and nothing entertains tired, bored people quite like a harsh public shaming in the middle of a mundane workday. "Mrs. Rollins, open that box right this instant," ordered Richard, planting himself firmly in front of her, with his thick arms crossed over his heavy stomach, to assert his absolute dominance. "The supposed thefts in this facility are going to end today, and you are going to be the prime example for everyone else who thinks they are clever enough to steal from me." Mary did not respond with words at first, simply lowering her calm gaze toward the dusty concrete floor and pressing her lips together until they lost all their natural color. A small group of uneasy workers had already formed a tight semicircle around them, and a few individuals covertly pulled out their mobile phones to record the rapidly escalating confrontation. "Are you completely deaf, woman? Because I told you to open that box right now," repeated Richard, raising his voice to a much higher and more threatening pitch that echoed off the high warehouse ceiling. "Either you open it right here in front of the entire crew, or I will immediately call corporate security and hand you over to the city police in handcuffs, so you better choose your next move wisely." The calloused hands of Mary trembled slightly, not out of any sort of fear, but from the immense weight of contained anger and the heavy burden of enduring countless afternoons of twisted glares and whispered insults behind her back. However, this particular time Richard had gone entirely too far, creating a malicious public spectacle with a captive audience and recording cameras watching her every single calculated move. Taking a profound breath, she took a steady step toward an oxidized metal bench sitting near the gate, placed the cardboard down with extreme delicacy, as if it contained ancient porcelain, lifted the flaps one by one, and stepped back to let everyone see the absolute nothingness inside. A confused murmur quickly rippled through the tight circle of watching employees, prompting someone in the back to let out a nervous laugh, while another worker whistled in blatant, undeniable mockery. Richard Barnes leaned aggressively over the cardboard, sweeping his thick hand across the flat bottom as if he genuinely expected to uncover some invisible secret compartment hidden within the perfectly normal seams. He flipped the box entirely upside down, shook it violently, and held it up against the fading amber light of the late afternoon sun, only to find absolutely nothing inside the empty vessel. "What exactly is the meaning of this nonsense?" he growled, glaring fiercely at her with a deeply contracted brow, demanding to know if she was deliberately trying to make a massive fool out of him. "I am not trying to do anything of the sort, Mr. Barnes," she finally replied, speaking in a voice so incredibly calm and composed that it seemed to belong to an entirely different, peaceful reality. "You were the one who loudly stopped me and yelled across the yard. I am simply leaving my shift, as I do every single day, with an empty box that the company was going to throw into the garbage incinerator tonight. I have been taking these discarded boxes for a very long time, with the explicit permission of the previous warehouse manager, and it was never considered a problem by anyone in charge of this facility. Well, under my management, it is a massive problem," spat Richard, straightening his posture and loudly announcing to the crowd that absolutely nothing, not even trash, would be given away for free anymore. Just as Richard prepared to escalate his cruel punishment and demand further disciplinary action, Lucy Parker, the incredibly strict human resources manager, arrived walking briskly with a digital tablet tucked beneath her arm, and her forehead deeply creased in authoritative concern. She was a profoundly serious woman who had built her formidable career upon enforcing firm rules without exception. But when she saw Richard panting with rage and Mary quietly holding the empty box, a distinct shadow of doubt crossed her face. After carefully inspecting the empty cardboard herself, Lucy sternly reminded Richard that company protocol explicitly forbade public employee searches and firmly declared that his highly unprofessional behavior would be the only thing documented in the official incident reports that evening. Dismissed gracefully by the human resources manager, Mary nodded politely without offering a single smile, adjusted the empty cardboard comfortably in her tired arms, and walked confidently out the heavy metal gates without looking back at the stunned supervisor. What absolutely no one in that tense loading yard realized was that standing a mere 30 paces away, the billionaire owner Frank Vance had observed the entire ugly scene in total contemplative silence, feeling a strange, distant echo in his chest, as if his soul recognized her quiet dignity from a forgotten lifetime. Frank immediately instructed his trusted chauffeur Arthur Smith to discreetly follow the humble woman through the sprawling streets of Detroit. Mary walked 3 blocks until she reached the public bus stop, carefully balancing the empty cardboard box in her arms, as if she were transporting something incredibly fragile and precious. She climbed aboard the noisy vehicle, found a worn seat near the very back, next to a smudged window, rested her forehead against the cool glass, and allowed the towering brick buildings to blur past her weary eyes. Absolutely no one riding on that crowded city bus could possibly imagine the massive weight she carried within her chest, nor the quiet mission that drove her forward day after day. The transit vehicle rattled heavily as it crossed a large bridge spanning the murky river, gradually leaving the glittering commercial district behind, to enter the much humbler, forgotten industrial outskirts of the city. The wide asphalt avenues quickly gave way to narrow, cracked alleyways, and the bustling city noise was replaced by the familiar sounds of a tight-knit working-class neighborhood where stray dogs slept peacefully in the middle of the uneven roads. Mary stepped off the bus at a completely unsheltered stop near the very end of the line, arriving in a district known to the locals as Pine Ridge, where every neighbor knew each other by their first names. Trailing a safe distance of over 300 feet behind her, a sleek, dark luxury car moved incredibly slowly, blending into the shadows of the fading evening light, while maintaining a careful watch. Inside the plush cabin, Frank Vance tightly gripped his knees, his heart racing erratically as he began to recognize the scent of burning firewood mixed with the aroma of freshly baked bread drifting through the chilly evening air. Mary walked down a dirt path, squeezed between unplastered brick houses and leaning wooden fences, warmly returning the greetings of elderly women sweeping their porches and young children playing with a severely deflated basketball. She possessed a radiant, tender smile that made her look like a completely different person from the silent, guarded woman who had just endured public humiliation at the massive corporate warehouse. A tiny neighborhood boy with a gap-toothed grin ran toward her with his arms wide open, shouting with pure joy, as Mary knelt down and gently placed the empty cardboard box directly over his small head. The child shrieked with laughter, running wildly down the dirt path, wearing the box like a giant crown, excitedly announcing to the entire block that the precious building materials had finally arrived for the evening. Frank ordered his driver to stop the luxury vehicle next to a rusted street lamp, stepping out onto the cracked sidewalk and hiding his tall frame behind a concrete pillar to watch the joyful scene unfold from a distance. His pulse pounded loudly in his ears because something buried deep inside his subconscious was screaming that his feet had walked upon this exact same dirt many decades ago, long before he understood the concepts of wealth or betrayal. He cautiously peered around the corner and saw a humble, sprawling structure sitting at the very end of the path, surrounded by a patched wooden fence and topped with a heavily repaired tin roof. Over the wide-open gate, where several tired mothers and laughing children were freely walking in and out, hung a severely weathered wooden sign displaying deeply carved letters painted in fading white. Frank narrowed his sharp eyes to carefully read the old wooden sign, and when the words finally came into focus, his strong legs immediately gave out beneath him, causing a crushing, invisible weight to slam heavily against his chest. The sign proudly read, "Alice's Little Beacon, proudly founded by Alice O'Connor," and seeing that specific name instantly robbed the billionaire of his breath, forcing him to stumble backward in complete shock. He desperately reached out with his left hand to brace himself against the rough brick wall of an adjacent house, while his trembling right hand flew up to cover his mouth to stifle a sudden agonizing gasp. That name, deeply carved into the wood, belonged to the exact same woman who had miraculously saved him when he was nothing more than a starving, terrified toddler clinging to his dying mother. Alice O'Connor was the legendary warm-hearted woman who had graciously welcomed his gravely ill mother into a forgotten sanctuary surrounded by mud and poverty, providing them with a safe haven when the rest of the cold city had firmly locked its doors. Frank had solemnly sworn upon his mother's deathbed to return and honor Alice's boundless generosity, a sacred vow that he had entirely abandoned as he spent the subsequent decades building a ruthless logistics empire and accumulating massive fortunes. "It cannot possibly be the same place," he whispered to the chilly wind, his voice breaking into a raspy, almost inaudible sob as hot tears unexpectedly flooded his eyes and spilled freely down his cheeks. As he stared at the humble facade of the shelter, the most feared corporate executive in 3 different states finally felt the icy hand of his forgotten past gripping the back of his neck with undeniable force. Frank Vance found himself completely unable to move away from the rough brick wall, allowing his tears to flow without any permission, sliding down his face and soaking into the expensive silk collar of his tailored shirt. He had never cried like this in a public street, nor had he ever allowed another human being to see him, with slumped shoulders and trembling lips, resembling a broken man who had just recognized the face of a beloved ghost. From the other side of the dirt path, coming from within the patched wooden fence, he could hear the beautiful sounds of children laughing, women giving gentle instructions, and the heavy clattering of a large soup pot being placed onto a warm stove. The billionaire wiped his eyes with the back of his trembling hand, took a ragged breath, and desperately attempted to piece together the shattered fragments of his earliest childhood memories that had just exploded across his mind. Realizing that he was absolutely not emotionally prepared to face the women inside the bustling shelter just yet, Frank slowly pushed himself away from the supporting wall and took several hesitant steps backward into the comforting shadows. He quietly returned to his idling luxury vehicle, sliding into the back seat and closing the heavy door with a soft click, remaining in complete silence for several long minutes while staring blankly at the plush ceiling. When his loyal chauffeur gently asked if they should return to the corporate office, Frank replied with a severely broken voice that they must go straight home because he desperately needed to uncover the absolute truth about the woman carrying the empty boxes. Inside the warm and bustling walls of Alice's Little Beacon, Mary had just placed her latest cardboard delivery onto a long, scratched wooden table, sitting right in the center of the main indoor courtyard. There were already several other boxes stacked neatly upon the table, some flattened out like thick blankets, while others had been carefully sliced into precise geometrical shapes by skilled, loving hands. A little girl named Emily tugged gently on Mary's sleeve with sparkling eyes, asking if the new box was big enough for the baby crib, to which Mary replied with a tired but genuine smile that it was perfectly sized. Mary hung her worn coat on a rusty nail near the entrance and walked toward the busy kitchen, where the incredible aroma of a rich, hearty stew was currently filling the entire building. Rose Evans, a robust and cheerful woman who handled all the carpentry and sewing for the beloved shelter, wiped her flour-covered hands on a towel and walked over to greet Mary with a deeply concerned look in her kind eyes. Rose was the absolute master at transforming the discarded cardboard from the logistics warehouse into beautiful functional furniture for the homeless mothers, creating sturdy little cribs and small storage chests decorated with bright, hopeful colors. Seeing the lingering distress on her friend's face, Rose asked what had happened, prompting Mary to quietly confess the horrifying details of the public humiliation she had suffered at the hands of the cruel new supervisor, Richard Barnes. Mary admitted her terrifying fear that if Richard successfully fired her, the shelter would lose a massive portion of its secret funding, since she spent nearly all her spare wages buying rice milk and fresh fruit for the children. Rose gently placed both her strong hands upon Mary's trembling shoulders, offering a comforting squeeze, while reminding her that her late mother, Alice O'Connor, always taught them to solve massive problems one tiny piece at a time, like slowly simmering beans over a low fire. Meanwhile, sitting completely unnoticed in a quiet corner of the busy room, 12-year-old Matthew Carter was quietly observing the conversation with incredibly sharp, highly perceptive eyes that missed absolutely nothing that happened within his home. Matthew was an orphan who had been raised in the shelter since infancy, and he carried a secret. Earlier that evening he had peeked through a crack in the fence and seen a wealthy man in a dark suit weeping uncontrollably by the street lamp. The intelligent boy decided to keep this strange sighting to himself for the moment, sensing that the mysterious crying man was somehow connected to the ancient stories that Mary constantly told the younger children before bedtime. Across the sprawling city, locked securely inside the private study of his enormous silent mansion, Frank Vance eagerly accepted a dusty yellowing folder from the hands of his incredibly efficient personal assistant, Patty Baker. Patty had spent hours digging through the deepest, most forgotten archival basements of the corporate headquarters to find the box labeled with the name of Frank's mother, Teresa, containing decades-old donation receipts and personal correspondence. Frank dismissed his assistant with a trembling wave of his hand, pushed aside a crystal glass of water, and spread the ancient, delicate documents across the polished mahogany surface of his massive executive desk. Among the faded black-and-white photographs and handwritten ledgers, he found a piece of paper folded into 4 neat sections, written in his mother's familiar, elegant handwriting, addressed directly to Alice O'Connor. Frank unfolded the fragile paper with extreme care, his heart pounding violently as he read his mother's final words, where she explained that her medical time was rapidly running out, and that she was finally making peace with her inevitable departure. Teresa begged her dearest friend Alice to always protect the beautiful shelter she had built, and pleaded that if her son Frank ever returned, Alice must remind him that a true man is measured by what he gives to others, not what he selfishly hoards. Attached to the incredibly emotional letter was a highly detailed ledger written by Alice herself, proudly listing every single item purchased with the money from Teresa's pawned gold earrings, baby formula, winter blankets, school books, and a tiny mango tree planted in the courtyard. Reading the word mango completely shattered Frank's remaining emotional defenses, causing him to drop the faded paper onto the desk and bury his weeping face securely into both of his trembling hands. While Frank wept over his broken promises, Mary sat in the tiny cramped room she rented a few miles away from the shelter, gently tracing her fingers over 3 framed photographs sitting upon a small wooden nightstand. One picture showed her mother, Alice, wearing a messy cooking apron. Another showed a young Mary laughing heartily, but the third and most worn photograph displayed Alice and a very sick Teresa, wrapping their loving arms around a skinny, terrified little boy with enormous eyes. Mary gently whispered to the skinny boy in the photograph, wondering aloud where life had taken him, and recalling how her mother, Alice, had spent her entire life waiting by the front door, praying that the boy would one day return to visit. Following a strange, inexplicable instinct that she could not fully understand, Mary took the old photograph and taped it directly to her bathroom mirror, hoping that somehow the universe would finally bring the lost child back home. When Mary arrived at the Southern Horizon storage facility the very next morning to begin her grueling shift, she instantly noticed a heavy, deeply toxic atmosphere hanging over the entire warehouse floor. Her co-workers were actively avoiding her gaze, whispering behind massive stacks of inventory, and quickly hiding their mobile phones whenever she walked down the long, dimly lit aisles to collect her packing materials. Her closest work friend, Yvonne Carter, rushed over with a terrified expression and quietly pulled her behind a tall shelf to show her a viral video playing on a glowing screen, proving that someone had maliciously uploaded the previous day's confrontation to the internet. The heavily edited video falsely portrayed Mary as a caught thief, accumulating over 40,000 views in a single night, and generating hundreds of cruel, mocking comments from completely clueless strangers across the city. In the glass-walled executive offices overlooking the massive warehouse floor, Richard Barnes slammed his thick fist aggressively against a sleek conference table, proudly showing the viral video to 2 deeply concerned sub-managers while his face flushed a brilliant, triumphant red. He loudly demanded that Mary be fired before the stroke of noon, claiming that her continued presence was a massive liability to the company's public image, and entirely ignoring the established human resources protocols regarding proper investigations. Colin Adams, a generally prudent sub-manager, nervously attempted to calm Richard down, reminding him that the ultimate owner, Mr. Vance, required strict documentation for terminations, to which Richard arrogantly screamed that the billionaire owner could come down and see the absolute mess for himself. What the deeply corrupt supervisor failed to realize was that Frank Vance had already seen the absolute truth with his own 2 eyes, and a massive storm of righteous fury was currently gathering just over the horizon. The bright morning sun streamed warmly into the bustling courtyard of Alice's little beacon, where Rose Evans was finally putting the finishing decorative touches on a remarkably sturdy crib, constructed entirely from layers of thick, reinforced cardboard. She had carefully lined the inside with incredibly soft, donated pastel fabrics, painted bright yellow stars across the exterior walls using leftover acrylic paints, and reinforced the delicate corners with extra binding tape to ensure absolute safety. A gentle commotion near the heavy wooden gate announced the arrival of Clara Clark, a deeply exhausted teenage mother who had just been discharged from the city hospital, carrying her precious newborn son wrapped tightly in a thin, worn blanket. When Clara saw the beautiful starry crib waiting perfectly prepared for her child, she immediately dropped to her knees on the stone floor, weeping with profound gratitude because she had genuinely believed her baby would have to sleep in a cold, empty drawer. Matthew Carter, watching the deeply emotional scene from his favorite spot near the kitchen door, quietly approached Rose after the young mother had settled her baby into the cozy new bed. He tugged gently on Rose's apron strings and whispered that he had been thinking constantly about the crying man wearing the expensive suit who had hidden behind the street lamp the previous evening. Rose paused her busy cleaning, her heart skipping a strange beat as she listened to the highly perceptive child describe the sorrowful stranger feeling a sudden electric chill race rapidly down her spine as the pieces began to align in her mind. She firmly instructed the boy to keep his remarkable observation a strict secret for the time being, sensing that something incredibly massive and life-changing was slowly approaching the humble patched doors of their beloved sanctuary. Just a few short hours later, an unassuming dark sedan parked quietly near the rusted fence, and a remarkably tall man stepped out into the warm afternoon breeze, wearing incredibly simple dark trousers and a plain button-down shirt without a tie. Frank Vance had actively chosen to leave his intimidating corporate armor securely locked away in his closet, deciding instead to approach the sacred grounds of his childhood as a deeply humbled son seeking desperate forgiveness. He pushed open the heavy wooden gate and stepped into the lively courtyard, completely ignoring the curious stares of the busy women as his tear-filled eyes locked instantly onto the ancient twisted trunk of the massive mango tree growing in the corner. He distinctly remembered eating sweet sticky fruit while sitting upon the flat stone resting directly beneath its wide branches, while his dying mother watched him with pure, unconditional love from the nearby kitchen doorway. Rose Evans was the very first person to cautiously approach the emotional stranger, wiping her damp hands upon a towel, and politely asking if there was anything the shelter could possibly help him with on this fine day. Frank opened his trembling mouth to speak, but the incredibly overwhelming weight of 1,000 returning memories temporarily robbed him of his voice, forcing him to point weakly toward the ancient tree and the worn stones of the courtyard. He finally choked out his name, introducing himself as Frank Vance, but quickly added that his mother was Teresa, the incredibly sick woman who had died many years ago on a borrowed cot in the back room of this exact house. Upon hearing that highly specific legendary name, Rose dramatically dropped her cleaning towel directly onto the dusty dirt floor, her eyes widening in absolute shock as she loudly whispered a prayer to the heavens above. At that exact miraculous moment, Mary Rollins stepped out of the busy kitchen doorway, wearing a flour-dusted apron and carrying a large wooden mixing spoon in her right hand. She stopped completely dead in her tracks, her breath catching violently in her throat as she stared directly into the sorrowful, pleading eyes of the incredibly wealthy man standing before her in the sunlit courtyard. She did not instantly recognize him by his mature facial features, but the sheer emotional intensity radiating from his posture instantly connected with the faded photograph of the skinny boy she had lovingly taped to her bathroom mirror the night before. "You are the little boy from the picture," she whispered softly, her eyes instantly filling with warm, joyful tears as the unbelievable truth crashed over her with the beautiful force of a long-awaited miracle. Without a single moment of hesitation or a single word of reproach for his decades of painful absence, Mary walked swiftly across the dirt courtyard and wrapped her arms securely around the weeping billionaire, embracing him exactly like a long-lost brother returning home from a terrible war. They sat together on a long wooden bench resting beneath the shady leaves of the mango tree, where Mary gently placed a battered tin box onto the table, explaining that her mother Alice had left it exclusively for him. Inside the rusted tin were fading photographs, a small lock of hair, and a thick, beautifully handwritten diary, where Alice had meticulously recorded the exact day she welcomed Teresa and her terrified, wide-eyed little boy into their loving home. Frank pressed the open diary tightly against his chest and sobbed openly, finally releasing decades of frozen corporate coldness, completely surrounded by the unconditional warmth of the family he had forgotten. While a beautiful healing reunion blossomed beneath the mango tree, a highly toxic storm was successfully executing its dark purpose within the glass-walled offices of the Southern Horizon storage facility across town. Richard Barnes had relentlessly pressured the executive team throughout the morning, leveraging the disastrous public relations nightmare caused by the viral video to completely override standard disciplinary procedures and force an immediate termination. Lucy Parker. The conflicted human resources manager finally signed the official separation documents under severe duress, completely unable to reach Frank Vance on his private phone lines because the billionaire was currently weeping in a dirt courtyard. However, Lucy secretly copied every single piece of security footage, internal email, and violated protocol document into an encrypted hidden folder on her personal computer, firmly believing that a massive reckoning was inevitable. When Mary returned to the massive logistics facility later that afternoon to begin her second shift, she was gently but firmly stopped at the front gates by Bernard Underwood, an elderly security guard with incredibly sad, apologetic eyes. He handed her the freshly printed termination papers, speaking in a very low whisper to explain that he had strict, undeniable orders to deny her entry due to the public scandal, and expressing his profound sorrow over the massive injustice. Mary accepted her devastating fate with quiet, unshakable dignity, nodding respectfully to the kind guard before turning around to begin her long walk back to the bus stop, carrying nothing but her purse. Just before she left, Bernard discreetly slipped a thick sealed envelope into her hands, whispering that it was a highly confidential package from Yvonne Carter, containing absolute proof of everything she would ever need to fight back. Mary walked several miles through the noisy city streets until she found a quiet, isolated iron bench sitting beneath a large oak tree in a small municipal park, far away from the chaotic traffic and the prying eyes of strangers. With fingers trembling from a complex mixture of sudden unemployment and burning curiosity, she carefully tore open the thick envelope provided by Yvonne and pulled out several pages of closely written, incredibly detailed notes. The letter revealed a horrifying, systemic truth. Richard Barnes was not merely an abusive supervisor, but a highly organized thief who had spent years stealing massive quantities of expensive corporate inventory and selling it directly to the local black market. To cover up his massive discrepancies, Richard specifically targeted vulnerable, hard-working women, publicly accusing them of minor infractions to create convenient scapegoats and entirely distract the corporate auditors from his own massive, highly lucrative crimes. Yvonne's letter specifically detailed the tragic, heartbreaking case of Daisy Miller, a former night shift worker who had been brutally framed and fired by Richard just a few months prior under incredibly similar, entirely fabricated circumstances. Because of the sudden, devastating loss of her income, Daisy had been brutally evicted from her apartment and temporarily lost physical custody of her young son, forcing her to survive by selling homemade pastries near a busy bus terminal. Reading about another innocent mother suffering such immense catastrophic pain ignited a blinding, righteous fire deep within Mary's soul, completely erasing any lingering sadness she felt over her own unjust termination from the corrupt logistics facility. She carefully folded the explosive documents, pressed them tightly against her chest, and wiped away her final tears, realizing that her firing was not a defeat, but rather the crucial key needed to unlock a massive chain of long-overdue justice. When Mary finally pushed open the heavy wooden gates of Alice's little beacon later that evening, she found Frank Vance sitting comfortably on the ground, happily sharing a simple dinner of stew and bread with the laughing children. She walked directly toward him, her face radiating an intense, unshakable determination, and gently asked him to step away from the loud courtyard to review some incredibly urgent information she had just received from the warehouse. Frank instantly noticed the fierce spark of battle burning brightly in her eyes, quickly wiping his mouth with a napkin and following her into the quiet, dimly lit kitchen, completely unaware of the massive storm he was about to unleash. Mary handed him the explosive letter, stating clearly that she absolutely did not want her warehouse job back, but instead demanded absolute, undeniable justice for every single woman who had been destroyed by his company's severe negligence. Frank read the detailed pages in absolute silence, his jaw clenching so tightly that the muscles in his neck strained against his collar, as the horrifying realization of what had occurred beneath his own corporate banner settled heavily upon his shoulders. The deep, sorrowful guilt he had been carrying all afternoon instantly transformed into a blazing, highly focused fury, completely erasing the broken man and summoning the ruthless, incredibly powerful corporate titan who commanded absolute authority. He immediately pulled his modern smartphone from his pocket, dialing his fierce private investigator Ethan Reed and firmly ordering him to assemble the finest corporate lawyers, Ian Vickers and Valerie Page, for an emergency all-night strategy session. Frank looked directly into Mary's eyes and swore a sacred vow that by the time the sun set the following day, the men who had poisoned his company and harmed these women would be completely eradicated from the industry. Early the next morning, Frank and Mary traveled together to a cramped, deeply impoverished apartment hidden behind a noisy neighborhood bakery, searching for the disgraced former employee mentioned in the secret letter. Daisy Miller answered the peeling wooden door wearing a faded cooking apron, her eyes widening in absolute terror and confusion when she recognized the famous billionaire and the woman from the viral internet video standing on her modest porch. Frank did not offer a formal handshake. Instead, the towering corporate owner dropped directly onto his knees upon the cracked linoleum floor of her tiny kitchen, humbly bowing his head and begging for her absolute forgiveness for his company's massive failures. He swore to Daisy that her stolen dignity, her lost wages, and her completely disrupted life would be fully restored before the week ended, and promised that she would play a crucial role in preventing this tragedy from ever happening again. Armed with an impenetrable mountain of newly gathered evidence, including sworn affidavits from multiple victims, financial traces of the black market sales, and the hidden digital backups provided by Lucy Parker, Frank orchestrated a massive trap. He summoned a mandatory, highly urgent executive board meeting at the very top of his gleaming glass corporate tower in downtown Detroit, requiring the immediate attendance of every single regional manager and operational supervisor in the entire district. Richard Barnes confidently strutted into the luxurious mahogany-paneled boardroom, wearing a smug, arrogant smirk, entirely convinced that he was about to be officially commended for swiftly handling the public relations disaster caused by the viral video. The corrupt supervisor pulled out a plush leather chair to sit, completely unaware that the heavy doors were being securely locked by security guards standing firmly on the outside of the soundproof executive suite. The arrogant smirk instantly vanished from Richard's flushed face, replaced by a mask of absolute paralyzing terror when his eyes finally traveled toward the front of the massive table and saw exactly who was sitting there. Sitting directly to the right of the incredibly furious billionaire owner was Mary Rollins, dressed in her simple, humble clothing, holding her worn purse comfortably on her lap, and staring at Richard with a gaze of pure, unbreakable steel. Richard aggressively demanded to know what a fired warehouse worker was doing inside a highly classified executive meeting, desperately attempting to project authority. But his voice cracked pitifully under the crushing weight of Frank's silent, deadly glare. "Sit down and keep your mouth completely shut," Frank commanded with a voice so incredibly cold and sharp that it seemed to instantly drop the temperature of the entire executive boardroom by several terrifying degrees. Over the next agonizing hour, Frank ruthlessly and methodically destroyed Richard's entire existence, throwing undeniable bank records, photographic evidence, and sworn victim statements directly onto the polished table for every single executive to witness. He loudly declared that Richard was officially terminated with absolute cause, heavily penalized, and immediately handed over to the city authorities, who were already waiting patiently in the lobby with shiny metal handcuffs. Before the defeated, trembling supervisor was dragged out of the room, Mary stood up and delivered a final devastating blow, stating that Richard thought he was crushing weak women. but he had actually awakened an entire family of unbreakable survivors. As the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind the ruined thief, the remaining executives sat in terrified, breathless silence, fully realizing that a massive, completely unstoppable era of profound change had just begun within the massive logistics empire. During the vibrant, hopeful weeks that followed the dramatic removal of the corrupt supervisor, the entire atmosphere within the massive Southern Horizon storage facility completely transformed, breathing with a fresh, undeniable sense of profound relief. Workers who had previously kept their eyes glued to the concrete floor out of paralyzing fear began greeting one another with loud, cheerful voices and warm, genuine smiles that echoed pleasantly across the busy loading docks. Yvonne Carter, the brave woman who had secretly smuggled the crucial evidence out of the gates, was officially promoted to the position of senior shift supervisor, completely replacing the toxic management style with genuine fairness and immense respect. Daisy Miller joyfully accepted a newly created corporate role, proudly walking through the warehouse doors, not as a humble packer, but as the official director of employee welfare and internal protection, actively ensuring that no worker would ever suffer in silence again. Despite his massive, sweeping victories in the corporate world, Frank Vance still carried a deep, painful void in his personal life, regarding his severely strained relationship with his incredibly distant teenage son, Sam Vance. Since the tragic passing of Sam's mother many years ago, the father and son had drifted incredibly far apart, living like two silent, unapproachable ghosts, wandering through the massive, echoing halls of their luxurious, deeply empty mansion. Seeking desperate guidance, Frank confessed his profound parental failures to Mary during a quiet evening in the shelter's kitchen, admitting that all his massive wealth could not buy back the crucial years he had selfishly chosen to spend at the office. Mary smiled warmly and offered incredibly simple, brilliant advice. Bring the boy to the shelter, without any grand, complicated explanations, and simply let him witness the beautiful, unpolished truth of where his family truly came from. The next day, Frank brought Sam to Alice's Little Beacon, where young Matthew explained that the shelter's beloved mango tree had been planted by Sam's grandmother, Teresa, after she sacrificed her gold earring so future children would always have food. Deeply moved by the story of his own family's kindness, Sam embraced his father in forgiveness. Soon afterward, journalist Anna Foster shared the shelter's inspiring story nationwide. But Mary insisted that the focus remain on Alice O'Connor's legacy, Rose's handmade cardboard cribs, and the children rather than herself. The broadcast sparked overwhelming public support, attracting volunteers' donations and funding that transformed the once struggling shelter into a thriving community center with new facilities while preserving the cherished mango tree. At the same time, Frank announced that a permanent share of his company's profits would support vulnerable workers through the newly established Alice O'Connor Foundation, honoring the woman who had taught him the true meaning of wealth. On the final evening of the year, everyone whose lives had been touched by the shelter gathered beneath the mango tree for a candlelit celebration. Surrounded by friends, families, and grateful children, Mary was invited to speak and reflected on the lessons she had learned. She explained that people had once judged her for carrying empty boxes, yet true value lies not in possessions, but in love, compassion, and service to others. Material wealth fades, while dignity, kindness, second chances, and promises faithfully kept create lasting change. She reminded everyone that even the humblest acts of care can become hope for those in need, and that a life devoted to helping others is the only legacy that truly endures.